Last time on the Kaiju Apostle Podcast.
Mr. Guzman, Luis, thank you. And can I just say, I loved you in IMDb.
What all starts with a quick look-see into someone's bag, and then it's a brisk peek-a-rooney at our phone records. And before you can say 1984, the thought police are forcing you to bend and spread.
Bend and spread? Are the thought police gonna make love to us?
Do they find thoughts in our butts? I knew I should have read that book.
I know it's sad, but death is a natural part of life, and by the time I finish this sentence, 100 people will have died in China.
Why did you stop talking? I have to call my pen pal.
Welcome back to the Kaiju Apostle Podcast, the show where two seminarians discuss and read way too freaking much into giant monster films. I'm David.
I'm still Chris.
And we're dead.
Oh my God, not again.
Not again. When did that happen?
I don't want to talk about it. It's a long story.
Well, we got plenty of time. But yeah, it's officially our last episode. To all those who were wishing for Godzilla 1998, we're sorry.
He's talking to me.
Yeah. Which, you know, you're more than welcome to watch it if you want.
True. I did. This one is the sequel to that one. So I did kind of spoil myself a little.
Yeah. Which is funny that you make that joke when the movie does reference Godzilla 1998. So good job.
Well, it's weird because it goes Godzilla 1998, 2000, and then this one.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't totally get the trilogy they were going for here.
I don't either, but you know, that's why they get paid the big bucks and we don't, right?
It was just like, where's Matthew Broderick? I miss that guy. It's like Go Gadget bad movie without him.
I never did watch that one, did you?
No.
Yeah.
I was like too young to get Inspector Gadget, I think. Like I'm 90s kids. I'm sorry. I know you're old. You're in your early 30s. But like 90s kids, we have this such weird nostalgia that we were born during the first round of it. So I'm like, who cares about Inspector Gadget? So I missed it. I missed that one.
Yeah. Yeah, I watched the cartoon.
I remember it. Like when he looks like a cartoon, but all the rest are distressingly human characters. Like he's got the big round nose and everyone else looks
pretty normal.
Yeah.
Well, before we get into the movie, I have to ask, because there are people who do listen to the podcast that do enjoy the other notoriously toxic fandom, Star Wars. What's been your opinion on the High Republic books? And for those who aren't aware what the High Republic is, what is it?
It's, man, a good way to leave all the baggage of pretty much anything in the past 5 years of Star Wars behind.
Huh.
So, I mean, there's like two references, but I think one will just go to, actually probably both will go mostly unnoticed to most people. But it's kind of nice. It's like if you gave 5 of the best Star Wars writers free reign, and I really want to note that because it is a very diverse like creative team, but they actually probably are some of just the best we have. But yeah, it's set at 200 years before the movies, have Yoda in there, but other than that, don't reference them at all. Don't live in that same world essentially. It's kind of nice. I don't know about you, but like sometimes when you're watching something, you can just feel the discourse anyway.
Yeah.
Even when it's like, oh, there was something in Mando that I had thought, oh man, I remember someone tweeting about something like this, but there's just nothing that's going to bring that up here. So it was really nice to read something free from baggage that you're not calculating the whole time. Do I know this person? Am I missing this joke? It was nice to feel completely accessible again, but they're actually like good stories. They're good books. I've read the entire introductory wave so far.
Charles Soule?
Yeah.
I was going to say Sully. He did one, right?
Yeah, he did the Del Rey novel. And his two fiction books, Anyone and The Oracle Year, I really liked him. He's a fantastic writer. Those two were so violent. There was one scene in Anyone that made me like put down the book because it was so violent.
And he's the one that did some of the Vader comics, right?
He did the Vader comics. Yeah, he did a long run on the Daredevil comics. But yeah, I mean, the Vader stuff wasn't nearly as violent, but he's a fantastic fiction writer.
Yeah.
But holy cow. Yeah, Light of the Jedi. Light of the Jedi was, I liked Age of Ultron, but it had a little Age of Ultron-esque, like, it set up quite a bit. All of these books had to spend some pages setting everyone else up.
Yeah,
So,
that's kind of inevitable, though.
yeah, especially when you like have the prescience to know you're doing something with it. Like you're following up on it.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So definitely recommended.
yeah.
Okay.
If you're if you're looking to read again and like what you're reading, it's great.
What are you drinking?
I'm drinking Mellow Corn straight Kentucky corn whiskey.
Okay. Okay.
It's got a high burn, but it's also incredibly sweet. So it's kind of the sweet spot for me, pun intended.
So I've got some Pinot Noir going over here, which always makes me think of Kimmy Schmidt.
Oh, gosh. Which was such a great show until it suddenly was not.
Yeah.
But
I'll drink to that. All right. Well, Chris, what are we discussing tonight?
we're discussing, oh man, you know how long it took me to figure out what this movie was? We're talking about GMK, which I was like, Guck, Marry, Kill? And is it like All Out Monster Attack?
How old
Monsters
are you?
Attack? Yeah, it's a sleepover. We're filming this at 4 a.m. at our sleepover.
Oh boy.
Yeah, All Monsters Attack, All Out Monster Attack. There's a subtitle to it.
It's right at the top of the notes, Chris.
Oh, I'm not looking. I'm looking at you. Oh yeah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. I kept typing in GMK and I was like bringing up snowboarding gear. And it's like, no, I want the Godzilla.
Oh boy,
Man,
that's great.
I just want to say, like, when everyone is trying to protect me from spoilers, y'all did such a good job because I didn't even know like this was a Godzilla movie, let alone like I think the first thing you said was we should watch GMK, and I was like, yes, what's that? So I was well out of the loop on this one.
That's great. That's great.
This is the quality content that everyone's happy we came back to redeliver.
I know. I've missed this. I've missed this. All right. Well, Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah Giant Monsters All Out Attack was released on December 15th, 2001. So, time for the plot summary. You ready, Chris?
Oh man, this one's pretty like heavy hitting.
All right, let's do it.
So here we go. Everyone is different. No two people are the same. Some people are about to be run over. Frankie has about 5 seconds. Some people are very tall and merciless. Quincy is destroying San Antonio. Some people wears glasses. Beth looks like a dude. Some people are squirrel-handed. Gregor is a weird name. Some people have braces. Some people have headgear. Fran could play linebacker for the Raiders. Some people have rigged the enemy base with explosives. Albert has. Some people have a southern accent, and those are hot. Trisha is a severe hottie. Some people are being fangoriously devoured by a gelatinous monster. Hillary's legs are being digested. Everyone is different. No two people are not on fire. Aww.
It's like I just watched the movie for the first time. Wow,
Oh, man. I'm flattered. Thank you.
It's like you spent like all night on that thing, man.
I did. I'm a little tired.
Oh man.
All right. Time for the poll, Chris. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So we announced the final episode. So this movie played an important role for David in starting the podcast. But we want to know, does this film work for you? Is it...
That's the Twitter discussion, the poll.
Oh my God. I had already scrolled down. We are losing it. And by we... Hang on. Good Lord. Oh, this is awesome. I love this. Okay.
Did you not look at this before?
No, I've never looked at it before.
Oh, well, I thought, okay. How do you manage to avoid the poll each week?
Well, I know when you're going to post it, so I just scroll past the avatar when I see it. Or sometimes I just see the account as tweeted with a poll, and I'm like, nope.
Okay.
All right, let's go to the poll instead. All right. So it's common knowledge at this point that Anguirus and Varan were meant to be in GMKAV. However, let's be honest, they really missed out by not casting the greatest kaiju of them all, the son of Godzilla. Which fantastic version should have been included? So we're going to start from the least favored, which so the least favored was Final Wars Minya, which is like when the high priest drops the robes and picks up the knife.
Mm-hmm.
Final Wars. So that one clocked in pretty low.
Yeah.
Fortunately. The next one was Godzuki, which I love that. He's chubby like me. I'm not winged like him though. And so he was the second. Showa Minya came in second, which was great. But coming in at almost half was just Godzilla Jr. Should have been included here.
And that's the one from the 90s films.
Okay, sure. With Godzillasaurus Rex.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. How would they have explained him coming back here? Like, in the world of GMK, what's your backstory for revitalized Minya?
Aliens.
They brought Godzilla Jr. and Ghidorah at the same time.
What's funny is okay. Well, since you already started, why don't you just go ahead and get going on the Twitter discussions?
We're totally in practice here. All right, so it played an important role for David in starting the podcast.
Just pick it right back up.
I am, yeah. So yes, does this work for you, or was it overhyped? Which, to be fair, I'm not sure it was overhyped because I didn't hear about it. So, Monsters and More says, personally, can't see how people like this movie much. Sure, the monster fights are fun and the music is decent, but there's not much more to the movie. That's kind of a damning. My brother always makes fun of me when I do reviews like that. I'm like, well, I liked this and I liked this, but I didn't like the rest. It's like, what's left? But, returning favorite Faye says
favorite.
Faye, don't block me for that. Easily the best Godzilla film since the original, in my opinion. Has a lot to say, is genuinely interested in its characters, and looks fantastic. Kind of running the gamut there. And then Masked Awesome says, doesn't work for me. The effects are severely lacking here, and I feel like a lot of threads get dropped, or at least severely looked away from in the back half. Toho's influence over Kaneko, I feel, also hurts the end product. I want to love it, but so far I've not been able to.
Oh. Yeah. So if you notice, we haven't done the trivia or backstory or anything like that, because just if you really care, you can go to Wikizilla and look that up. We don't have anything unique there. Or Gojipedia, you're right. But for you, Chris, something to keep in mind. So the director, Kaneko, so he did the Gamera trilogy in the 90s. Okay. So one of these days, I'm going to have you watch those because, as I've told you, watching those kind of soured me on the rest of the 90s movies, the Godzilla movies. I'm like, oh, this is so much better. And not that, like, I know
so they were
really
good, and the 90s ones were, the 90s Godzillas were bad.
Well, it's not that they're bad. It's just, it's kind of like, it's just with having such a lesser budget, they managed to do so much more, in my opinion. So it's just one of those things where I'm like,
seems to be how it works with a lot of movies, though.
Yeah. So it kind of feels like the Godzilla movies in the 90s felt less inspired after watching those. But that's a side point. But so it's the same director as those movies. He also ended up directing a few episodes of Ultra Q Dark Fantasy, which was a Ultra Q
unreleased one.
Yeah, well,
in
not
America.
here in the States. Yep. And then he also directed the show Ultraman Max.
Okay. That
That's
one's also not currently
correct. Yeah, it's
Okay.
between Ultraman Nexus and Ultraman Mabius. So it's like
Okay.
2005
So maybe it's will get it
is
someday.
hopefully. Yes. Yes. They took it off of Crunchyroll, which sucks, or Toku. But then the composer, which I guess we could go over the staff here. I was supposed to read
Yeah.
that earlier. Okay, so yeah, directed
And then
by
I screwed it all up.
yeah, directed by Shusuke Kaneko. So I already kind of went over some of that. The writers were Kiichi Hasegawa, which we'll get into him more later. Kaneko was a writer, and then Masahiro Yokotani, who would end up writing Godzilla Tokyo SOS. Okay, and then producers were Hideyuki Hanma and Shogo Tomiyama. Music was Ko Atani. So you would probably recognize him from like Gundam Wing or Shadow of the
Gundam
Colossus.
Wing. Yes.
Yeah. So
That's the only Gundam I've ever seen.
yeah, he also did the music for the Gamera trilogy as well.
Okay.
Cinematography was by Masahiro Kishimoto, and then special effects is Makoto Kamiya. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of really all the trivia backstory we're going to get into. So let's just go ahead and get in. Chris, since this was your first time watching the film and the last Godzilla film we're going to watch for the podcast, what were your thoughts?
It's funny reading these opinions because it felt like it's interesting. There was a lot to say, and I thought it was for the first time in a while, we know why Godzilla's back. So was this actually like essentially a soft reboot?
It was just
Or-
a standalone. Yeah.
Just a standalone. Okay.
Mhm.
So I actually really liked even if it was only grappling with the history of one movie, I still really liked that it felt like there was some continuity.
Mhm.
Like it raised the stakes a little bit, and we've been getting so used to like sci-fi Godzillas, at least from what we watched. I don't know where we would be in the middle,
Mhm.
but this was kind of like a nice like fantasy element to it,
Yeah.
and I appreciated that. And even like Ghidorah's backstory was far less sci-fi-y. I was a little bummed that like Mothra kind of loses some of what was going on with like the religion and the priestesses and all that, but I felt like in terms of giving Godzilla a little more weight, like his coming back got a little more weight. I'll trade Mothra's stuff to give him a little.
Yeah.
So I kind of like this. I could see where you'd say a lot probably did get dropped because it felt like there was a lot going on.
Mhm.
Because these weren't even like the three monsters. I mean, the three kaiju. There was still a lot going on. So I liked it. I really liked that it felt like there was something I wanted to say. It felt like it was really interesting to like grapple with it. I wonder how it would have felt like watching it as they released. Like if you somehow watched the first one and you caught them all in theaters as you went.
Yeah.
I wonder how this one would feel. But in terms of coming back for like one more episode, I liked it. We'd kind of separated enough from the past ones for me to kind of watch this on its own. And I think I had a better appreciation for it. Again, like I've said this before, and even sometimes watching like Sentai and Ultraman, I'm not like the monster fights don't do a lot for me.
Yeah.
So there was quite a bit of that in this movie. But I felt like the stakes were a little higher in it. And when some kaiju were like destroyed or their life energy was transferred, like there's more like depth to that. And it felt more consequential than just like when the Megazord destroys something and it turns around and explodes. And it's like, all right, well, it's back to normal life. Like not really. And even like the end, like, man, we won't talk about the end right this second, but
Yeah, I get that. I mean, that's one of the things too, like as much as I love Ultraman, especially these older ones, it's just like, Ultraman will defeat the monster. Then all of a sudden the guy who's Ultraman will run up and everyone's like, hey, where were you? Oh, I'm right here. Awesome. Let's go back and have drinks. And it's like that ending happens so many times. And like, I don't really care because I get it. But yeah, there's something where it's like, oh, there's actual like ramifications for what's happening here. Right.
Right.
Because I even made note of that where like this was one of the first times where we really see like a character being impacted by witnessing death. They're like, oh my gosh.
That's true.
You know, and like just being like the hospital scene, that reminded me of the original, you know, with just all the people on the stretchers and just like hearing the news. And it was just, there definitely was more of like feet on the ground, like in the thick of it, that we don't always get with these movies.
Yeah, it's, when buildings explode, it's just like, well, it was evacuated. Wink, wink.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like even the kids looking out the window and seeing the mushroom cloud, you know, like, but again, if you go back and you watch the Gamera films from the 90s, you can see like where that's just what he cares about, right? So like he's done comedy films, he did some of those you know, Roman pornos we talked about before. So he's kind of pretty skilled in multiple avenues. But yeah, it's just, there's definitely like, I feel like some of the best characterization we've got in a Godzilla movie really to date. Because I'll be honest, you know, so when I saw it for the first time, I think it was back in 2014. It was right before I got married, but I watched the dubbed version and I'm like, like it was fun. I didn't really think much of it. But now that I've watched the subtitled version and watched it more and more times, like it's quickly become probably my favorite apart from the original, just because the blend of that fantasy supernatural element is really interesting. I do like the way they've repurposed the monster. So, you know, like we talked about before, you know, it's supposed to be Aragon, Anguirus, and Varan. So that's why, you know, Toho's like, hey, no, we're going to do more that are more familiar. But that's why with Ghidorah's face, it actually has kind of a Varan look to it, because that was his way of like getting a compromise, because those were some of his favorite monsters. So if you go look at the design later, you'll notice it's a little different. But
I did wonder about that. I wondered if like the suits was this like the suits dying or...
No, it's, I mean, brand new suits as far as I know.
Well, the old ones, I mean.
Okay,
like, did they have to rebuild and they're just like, well, let's refresh it.
Gotcha.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a creative element there.
I don't know. I can't leave this fantasy element though. But like, you even bringing in the supernatural, because they were pretty biological. It was just like also irradiated.
Well, and that's with these monsters, they didn't even mention anything about radiation. It was these monsters were alive so many thousand years ago, and then they were killed, but then they still prayed to the spirits as, you know, protectors of the earth, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's no mention of them being radioactive at all, which really is in line with the original movies, because as we discussed with like Rodan and Mothra, like they're not irradiated. There's never, at least in the 60s and 70s, their origins were not explicitly mentioned that way. That's stuff that's usually added with like the dubs. So I think, I mean, really that's a pretty consistent characterization even for the monsters too. Sure. So I can appreciate that. I like the fact that with Admiral Tachibana, like I was looking at Dave Klatt's book. So Kaneko purposely cast someone that wouldn't look like your typical or act like your typical military guy. So I appreciate that. There's definitely that good father-daughter dynamic that I can appreciate, where it was, they're trying to figure things out, but it wasn't like, oh, Dad, why don't you love me? Like, it's just kind of a, hey, I'm obviously angsty, I'm a daughter, but like there wasn't like this dysfunction that took over the whole movie too, right? True. Which is probably more common for Western films, and it gets really annoying. With the score though, what I noticed is like, first of all, it's one of my favorite Godzilla scores of all time because of how like simplistic and mood driven it is. But there's one part when you see the first glimpse of Godzilla, the music actually goes kind of like a da da, like underwater with his fins. I was like, okay, there's no way that's a coincidence. Funny. Like that has to be intentional. And then of course, like I love the fact that when Godzilla shows up there to fight Baragon, like he looks over the hill like the original film, but obviously it's not his first appearance, right? And it's also a lot more violent because he breaks the hill down and kills everybody. But there's just nice little nods. You had mentioned like, you know, with Mothra, there's actually when she flies over the city, you notice the two girls there. That's supposed to be like a callback to the twins, which one of those girls was actually in the Gamera movies too. So that's just kind of his little.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I'm so unfamiliar being in this spot where I don't get that. Like, I'm so used to being the one rolling my eyes. Yeah, I get the joke. Oh my God, I get the joke.
Right.
But yeah, even in WandaVision, which I loved, it's like, oh, I see it. Oh, I get it. Oh, I get it. But like Godzilla, I'm like, oh, cool. He looked over a mountain. It was a callback to the original.
Yeah.
Weird.
But that's what I love is like with a lot of these movies, at least or with this one, a lot of those nods aren't going to be like slap you in the face. You need to know what happened in order to appreciate it. Right.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think that's something about the franchise's use of the visual language that we don't quite have in our American nostalgia bait. Like where Fuller House has to remake episodes of Full House to be like, oh, have you seen the original show? Yeah, that's why I'm watching this one. Whereas Godzilla just kind of uses that visual language in such a way that's like, if you know what to look for, you get it. But I should have known what to look for. I've seen Mothra, but I still didn't quite.
Yeah.
Could be an expectation thing too. I guess I didn't expect it to do that. So.
All right. So, talking points. We just really have a couple. We kind of wanted to keep this episode brief. But as we kind of alluded to, this movie means a lot to me because this is actually what got me started with the project itself when it was initially a blog. And I thought, hey, I'm going to blog through all the movies. And I'm like, oh, blogging is pretty much pointless these days. And then I eventually sold you on doing this somehow. But to kind of give a little bit of context, because I have talked about it before, but it's been a very long time.
Turn away from the microphone when I take a deep breath.
What's that? Oh, Tay-Zonday. Well, that was a burp. So for me, you know, what really started this project was going through, like I said, watching the Godzilla movies. This was back in 2018 and watching them subtitled really for the first time. And when I watched this movie, the scene, as we're going to go over this specific scene, it just hit me so hard and being like, wait a minute, like these movies I grew up with and really took for granted. I was like, there's really some deep stuff here and maybe not even necessarily intentionally. Right. So that's what got me going back and wanting to, you know, view these movies again and kind of have a different eye and see what I could pick out of it. So of course, and I say of course, but this scene that we're referring to is actually towards the end of the movie. So this is when Admiral Tachibana gets into the Satsuma, I think is what it is, little submarine, and allows himself to be eaten by Godzilla. He shoots the little drill missile and it punctures a hole in Godzilla. Godzilla thinks that, you know, I'm going to kill the other two protagonists and ends up killing himself. Right. So what I noticed is this first part here was a really a parallel to a particular view of the atonement. So Chris, since I would say you're the better theologian out of us, how would you define the atonement?
Well, I guess it in the most classic sense, atone comes from just the word that means to cover over. So when the Hebrew Bible talks about atonement, it's really just talking about covering. So it was like there's a problem, which is usually sin or uncleanness. And so to be atoned for would be for that to be covered over. But it actually starts in the garden when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. God actually makes atonement for Adam and Eve by covering their naked bodies. God acts as a priest by killing an animal. And then he takes its skin and covers Adam and Eve. So that shame that they feel by being naked is covered by the skin. So when we talk about atonement in the large sense, it just means covering. So like your sins are covered. It's no longer like in the Jewish imagination, if sin, uncleanness, or blood was open, it was calling for God's vengeance. So what you had to do is cover it. So what we're doing is covering the sin so that God doesn't see it, and we're not inviting that vengeance.
Correct.
But I guess when it talks about maybe more particular views of atonement, I think this one lends itself to one you might be better about with Christus Victor.
Correct. So taking that a little bit further, so in this context, when we're talking about the atonement, we're talking about Jesus dying on the cross for the payment of sins, right? So within different Christian traditions, and it largely varies between East and West, you either have a more Western view where Jesus would die for your sins as a way to deal with like God's wrath, or to really, it's a pay a penalty, right, of our sin. That's where we kind of get penal substitution, this idea that Jesus dies on our behalf to pay a debt. Whereas on the Eastern side of things, which is kind of where we see more of that Christus Victor element, that's where Jesus died on the cross. Yes, to free us from sin, but it's to defeat the powers of sin and death and evil, to free humanity to be made in the image of God, which is, theosis, right? So what I noticed is watching this, it plays kind of a correlation here with the idea of what's called ransom atonement. So again, going over the scene for those who may have not watched it in a while. So what's interesting is Godzilla is like literally the devil in this movie, right? This is the most demonic version of Godzilla we could think of. So then, Admiral Tachibana allows himself to be swallowed up by the devil. Of course, people are distraught, thinking all is lost, right? Like, hey, don't go. No, I need to do this. And then he gets swallowed up. He fires that last drill missile while still inside of Godzilla, which breaks through that existing wound. Not thinking twice about the wound, Godzilla prepares his atomic breath to kill Yuri and Takeda, Yuri being the main female protagonist and Takeda being her friend, only to experience this undoing at his own hands, right? The atomic breath goes through that hole and it blows him up. So how this plays into ransom atonement is... I'm going to give you a definition. I'm going to talk about the early church, how some of the people viewed it, but then I'm going to kind of relate this to a book that I'm sure many of you have read. So Alistair McGrath, in his book, Christian Theology, he describes ransom atonement as such. So really it started with Origen, going off of Jesus saying that he'd give his life as a ransom for sinners, which we see in like Matthew 20, I think in Luke or Mark as well. It's not
Mark 10:45. Yeah,
it's not a phrase that's used very often. So if Jesus' life was a ransom, the question is asked, who was it given to? Who was paid? Whereas, so Origen argued that it was the devil. So Gregory the Great, who was another church father, he took this a little bit further. He said that if the devil had rights over fallen humanity, then God had to figure out how to get the devil to lose his ownership. So this is Alistair McGrath here, quoting Gregory. So Gregory suggests the image of a baited hook. Christ's humanity is the bait, and his divinity is the hook. The devil, like a great sea monster, snaps at the bait, and then discovers too late the hook. And this is Gregory here. The bait tempts in order that the hook may wound. Our Lord, therefore, when coming for the redemption of humanity, made a kind of hook of himself for the death of the devil. So maybe it's not as explicit with Tachibana here, but it's this idea that the devil or Godzilla consumed his literally what would end up being his undoing, but it was a willing thing, right? It was something that he was tricked into doing, not realizing what would end up happening. To put it in more of a modern context, this is actually, I'm reading through Chronicles of Narnia with my son right now, and it's the exact same thing as Aslan and the White Witch, where, Edmund had betrayed his brother and sisters to the White Witch, and part of the deep magic is that a someone who commits treason has to die. And the White Witch knows that and brings that up to Aslan. And Aslan gives his own life in order to fulfill this obligation to this deep magic. So the White Witch talks about, well, who's going to protect him once you're gone? I can't believe you gave up your life for this. But he knew that there is an even deeper magic still, which allowed him to be resurrected, right? So that actually plays right into ransom atonement, Christus Victor, which if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis, he was very familiar with the early church writers, that's why he wrote the foreword for Athanasius is on the Incarnation. So
That's right.
So he's no stranger
Yeah.
to that at all. And he actually talks about like chronological snobbery when it comes to thought and whatnot. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I'm watching this movie and I see all these pieces line up. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's neat. But that wasn't like enough that like clicked it for me. Right.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, cool. Like I wasn't expecting that. I've seen this movie several times. I never picked that up. But
yeah.
it was the next scene that like tied everything in together. Right. So Godzilla dies, explosion. And then all of a sudden we're like, holy crap, the Admiral survived, right? It's a miracle.
Mhm.
And you see him on the walkway or whatever, and Yuri and Takeda run to him, but he says, hey, stop. I haven't checked to see if I'm still radioactive. So like we need to make sure. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, holy crap. Because if you're familiar with the gospel story in John 20, you know, Jesus tells his disciples, like, you know, or did he tell I can't remember. It was his, well, I guess the women would be the disciples too, but I don't remember who he specifically told this to, but he's like, do not hold on to me because I have not yet ascended to the Father.
That was Mary in the garden right outside the tomb.
Yep. So, I mean, right there, I'm like, okay, the first one, I was like, maybe it's just like a typical, you know, sacrificial story, right? It's not new. I mean, we saw that with the Mandalorian and the Crate Dragon, right? You know, he allowed himself to be eaten and then he blew it up. And, you know, like that in itself is not necessarily like what I would consider like a Christological image necessarily. That's not uncommon in stories. But then to have that come right after this whole like very explicitly, hey, do not touch me, as you know, you're surprised to see I'm alive. I was just like, what just happened to this Godzilla movie that I've been watching for the past hour and a half?
Yeah.
So like as I watched the Gamera films, you know, there's some explicit religious and theological, like specifically Judeo-Christian references in there. Like the second movie, the monster's called Legion, right? I'm trying to think. There's a couple other references in there too. I mean, it's a very spiritual set of films. But what I didn't realize is that the writer on this movie is, you know, Kiichi Hasegawa. So he's done a couple other, you know, movies as well, or shows. So he's done like The Big O, Zoids, SSSS Gridman, and he's doing the SSSS Dinah Zenon or whatever. But he was the head writer of Ultraman Nexus. And in Ultraman Nexus, it's a very theological, very spiritual Ultraman show, including like this random reference to the Book of Tobit. So I'm like, okay, you don't just pull the Book of Tobit out of nowhere. Like that's not something that you're just like, like I didn't even know what that was like a couple of years ago, and I went to seminary. Like you just don't talk about that. So when I put that together, I reached out to someone who's familiar, who's friends with Kaneko, and I'm like, hey, like, am I crazy for thinking this? This is before I knew about Hasegawa. And he had mentioned, he's like, hey, you know, like, I don't think that was intentional at all. Or at least like he wasn't aware of that idea. But again, pulling Hasegawa into I'm like, okay, that has to have been him coming from there. But yeah, like this scene or set of scenes is really what kickstarted this whole like, oh gosh, I need to start revisiting these movies and paying attention, because I know not every movie is going to be like that. But as we've found over the course of the Showa era, like there's some really good imagery and really some good depth there. It's just, do we have an eye to see it?
Right. Which I can make literally zero guesses in terms of chronological, like when does he discover the Book of Tobit? When does he write any of these movies? Right.
Yeah.
But for those maybe unfamiliar with the Book of Tobit, the book begins with, gosh, is Tobit the dad or the son?
I've actually never read it.
So there's a father figure in the Book of Tobit, and I'm going to call him Tobit, and then Twitter, you'll correct me.
Our Catholic Twitter friends will correct us.
So Tobit lives in Nineveh. So this takes place between Jonah and between Nahum. So Nineveh's still kind of on the right side, but it's starting to turn more towards Nahum's denunciation of it. So what Tobit does is the Syrians are killing a bunch of Jews and just leaving their bodies on the ground. So he goes and he starts burying them. So the Syrians say, like, don't leave the bodies out. He's like, no, what you're doing is inviting the wrath of God onto your country. So I'm actually trying to save the country by burying these Jews, like by making atonement for Nineveh by covering over the dead bodies. So whether or not it's like intentional, to read the book of Tobit is to understand some sort of atonement theory.
Yeah.
So it's hard to avoid.
Yeah. And obviously I don't want to spoil the Tobit reference in Nexus for not obvious reasons.
So it's a man who I'm guessing that Ultraman is about to get married, but then he gets stricken with blindness and needs fish scales to be able to see again because a demon has stricken him with his blindness.
I should not have opened that door because now you've already figured out the whole plot of Ultraman Nexus.
And all I had to do was read Tobit. I kind of think it's a little important maybe to say what's the difference between the Gojira and this one's, like the sacrifice.
Yeah.
So in the first one, you're going to have to fill in his name for me. The creator of the Oxygen Destroyer.
Dr. Serizawa.
Yeah, so Serizawa, like, he sacrifices himself so that the weapon can never be used again.
Mm-hmm.
So he, like, sacrifices himself to defeat Godzilla. But in this one, there's more of like a, like N.T. Wright describes as what happened to Jesus is he let evil unleash its fullest extent on him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that like he was separated from the evil. He like took it all. He was affected by it more than anyone else in the sense that he let evil have its worst on him. And then he goes right into the heart of it. Just like Jesus goes right into the heart of Hades when he's dead. And so in Jesus, in the Orthodox tradition, like preaches to all of those who are in Hades and takes them up with him. So same with the general, he goes into the heart of evil, lets evil have its worst on him. But it's actually evil unleashing itself that like makes it implode.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little more than just a sacrifice here. It's because in Gojira, he doesn't really have his full. It doesn't unleash itself. He doesn't kill himself, and that's kind of the difference. Is like for I think a lot of Christians, it's not that evil's been defeated. It's that evil exhausted itself.
Mm-hmm.
Evil was brought to its own limits, and the evil was shown to be lacking. And out of that lack comes Jesus claiming victory over it because it just doesn't have enough.
Yeah.
So it's not that Jesus comes with like super cross gun and just shoots evil to death, but it's like evil unloads its whole magazine on Jesus. And then he says, yeah, but I'm good now. I'm alive again to make it sillier. But that's the huge difference, I think, is that it's not just self-sacrificed in this movie. It's that evil is unloaded on him. He takes the full blunt of it. And Godzilla, this spectral demonic Godzilla is actually its own undoing, which is what we say happens to death. Death defeats itself in leading itself to its own end and realizing comes up short to stopping the Lord of Life from having life again.
Yeah. And he doesn't even recognize what's happening either. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Just like Satan thinks he's got Jesus on the hook, which is now mixing metaphors to what our old one was. But like, yeah, Satan doesn't realize that in putting Jesus up on the cross, Satan's actually putting himself to open shame.
Yeah.
As Colossians 2 puts it.
Yeah, great points. But yeah, I just, like I said, this really just kind of set the tone, I feel like, for the show, even if we haven't explicitly mentioned that. I was listening to a podcast this morning, discussing the difference between the Antioch and the Alexandrian churches, right? Or the school of thought, etc. And I think the one thing that people don't realize with Alexandrian thought is that, yes, they were very allegorical, but there was still like, you had to have this foundational belief that the text means something on a initial reading, right? Like that spiritual meaning wouldn't mean anything if there wasn't something initially being said. And I know we've had a couple of detractors with like, well, why are you trying to inject Christianity into these movies? And I'm like, well, some of them it's just there, right? But, in all of our approaches, it's never been well, it's not there, but we say it is. It's just, in an instance like this, it's like, I'm not saying that it was intentional. What I'm saying is I would be surprised if it wasn't. because
And really, aside from some of my more poignant and more breathtaking theological treatises at the end of the episodes, I like to think that we can point to most of them and say, like, this is where we're getting this.
yeah, absolutely.
This is at least a parallel. So.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just this ability to be like, hey, like we know the movie's trying to say something, but like, what if we could get you to think about it differently?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and really, but that's what the early church did as well, especially with like Origin. You know, it wasn't like hey, we're going to read this Hebrew Bible text and, you know, we're going to throw away what it meant in the beginning. It's just like, hey, like this is what it says. But like, if we believe what Jesus did on the road to Emmaus, showing, you know, how the scriptures testify of him, then this is really, if we want to take it to the next level, this is what the Spirit's trying to tell us. Right.
Yeah. And that's why I thought it was important to kind of note the differences between Gojira and this one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they are different. And we're not saying that the reading was equally valid in both.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep. All right. Last talking point is dealing with our past. So I did not feel comfortable getting into the history of World War II here. If you've noticed, we haven't really got into a lot of that. We've kind of danced around it, but yeah. I'm not a history scholar, especially not World War II. So, and I don't think you are either, Chris. But
no, certainly not.
Something I have been keeping in mind is Miroslav Volf has a book called The End of Memory. And in this book, as he recounts his time actually being not like Guantanamo Bay tortured, but being tortured, I think it was in 1984. He talks about really all of our tendencies to remember either rightly or incorrectly, right? So this idea that, you know, when we like suffer abuse, there could be a tendency to either romanticize the abuser, right? So we're thinking they're not as bad as they are, or we have the ability to see them as worse people as they really were, which I know is kind of a controversial thing to say, but as Christians, you know, we do have that obligation to remember rightly. So I look at this movie and I took a couple quotes out of here, right? So this idea that, you know, Godzilla, when he's formed, it was because, and I quote, because it's a compound of many people's will to survive. The souls of countless people who fell victim to the Pacific War congregated in Godzilla's body because people have forgotten. They've forgotten the agony of those killed in war, and they've forgotten their crimes. You know, so that's the embodiment of Godzilla in this movie, is a national refusal to allow what happened at that point. I wouldn't say identify who they are, but it doesn't shape their culture, right? Or maybe in real life it does, but the director is trying to be like, hey, like, it doesn't. You know, maybe it's just, again, I'm not as familiar, so I can't really speak to that. But I think it's probably leaning towards the fact that they don't think about it as often when we see Admiral Tachibana go, you know, did we really get rid of Godzilla 50 years ago? I doubted it, but I taught my men to be proud. Now look at that. And then his commander goes, you know, 50 years ago, the first Godzilla was killed with an unknown chemical compound. Nobody knows what it was. Existing weapons were useless. The armies could do nothing. People would have cried for non-armament. To maintain the military force, the Ministry of Defense has kept it a secret for 50 years, and so will I. So what he's saying here, I had to watch it a few times. He's like, we were so useless that if the public would have known that we didn't do anything, they would have been like, you guys are a waste. We need to get rid of this, right? And it's for their own pride. So it's not even just an individualistic we need to remember, right? But when our own politicians and government leaders create a narrative that shapes our national identity, because I mean, think about like 9/11, right? I mean, that changed the American landscape forever, you know, and as more things have come clean, it's not necessarily like, you know, the whole like jet fuel can't melt steel beams or whatever, but it's very clear there was a lot more going on than what we initially thought. And it's been used as a way to discriminate and oppress Middle Eastern and Muslim individuals and communities. And it's important to remember that. It's important to look at, you know, what what the TSA has done in our country and how it's one of the most ineffective policies we have set up. But we just look back at 9/11. Oh, well, we need to protect ourselves from terrorists, forgetting that, we have terrorists storming the Capitol building, right? What good was the TSA for that? They didn't need planes for that. So I think there's a danger in not allowing ourselves to remember things correctly. And I think this movie is really getting at the heart of that of, if we don't allow ourselves to remember what happened, and if we don't teach future generations what happened, we get Godzilla.
Yeah, I think I'm coming up with two kind of separate thoughts at the same time. So, work with me with them. I think
I'll
there's
work with you.
Oh, there's something similar kind of going on even with COVID right now, in terms of I read today that we've lost 400,000 Americans, which is a huge number in the sense it just Americans. But think about the way we talk about COVID still, as if it's still the pandemic, it's still the shamdemic. We've even lost our sense of memory about things that happened just now. So remembering people that we've been okay, I was 8 during 9/11, right? So for 1/4 of my life was the only time I grew up without hugely propagated, hugely socially acceptable forms of prejudice against brown bodies, right? So of course I've been raised a certain way, but of course it's because I've forgotten about something 20 years ago, almost 19 years ago, when we can't remember something that's happened this year. We can't remember 400,000 dead people this year, not to mention all the race and the social class dynamics that have impacted those deaths.
Yeah.
So this movie, not only it was amazing to me to hear this movie say this about something that happened 50 years prior to it. And we're talking about things that are happening today that are just as bad in terms of, well, oh God, I don't want to say that. But in terms of numbers, we're so callous to death around us now that we can't even remember things we're experiencing.
Yeah.
How could we remember 50 years ago? But I'm also, this one's a little different, but it's kind of getting into this whole collective identity of Godzilla. I don't know if you've ever heard of the scholar Michael Crosman, I think.
Crosman.
He's a pastor and a metaphysics professor, I believe. He's got this idea that even today we see collective ideologies and collective actions becoming its own beings of sorts. So Bible Project scholar Tim Mackey actually uses the comparison of he lives in Portland, so he always thinks he wants coffee because coffee culture is so strong that the collective want and desire for coffee in Portland affects him. So Crosman talks about sin in the same way, capital S, sin. Sin as a being that we all kind of, when we can't get over our own vengeances and revenge and thirst for evil and greed and lust, we make up this collective being known as sin.
Yeah.
So that's why Paul in Romans can talk about sin as something that has action and autonomy that we feed into it. So I thought this movie made a really interesting point about collective, I'm not even sure the right word, collective consciousness becoming its own thing in Godzilla. I don't know. It's such an I wish I had more metaphysics behind it. But even this whole idea of collective anger, collective refusal to be forgotten becoming Godzilla, picking a very familiar theme to Tokyo. We see that today. Our collective anger takes the form of that same xenophobia. So I don't know if I have a point to that. It's just my best thoughts come only during the episodes when they're half baked. So I always want to say I'm gonna get them recorded, and then someone can be like, "Well, that was terrible," and I'm like, "Yeah, well, I know."
That's why you
not
listen.
telling me anything new, buddy.
So you don't listen for the good takes. You're coming here because you want to
If
feel
you
good
listen
about
for
yourself.
the good takes, mute me every time I spoke.
And Chris just died. This podcast
Again.
literally is killing us the third time. But yeah, with truth telling, I mean, it's interesting. Again, you still have that dynamic here. So in the beginning of the film, you have the village chief where when the BS Digital Q team gets together, they're like, wait, this documentary is going to be fake, and he's like posturing like, I can't believe that you would do this. But then he gets in his car with what I assume to be his wife. He's like, oh man, we're going to be so rich, off of this. And it's like, okay, so clearly like you don't care about the truth, because you realize what it's going to do for you, right? But so that's how the whole the TV show or the channel, they're dynamic. But at the end, what we see is like, oh wait, we were the ones telling the truth, and people are paying attention. So why don't we do that? And maybe you could be like, okay, well, they're doing it because of popularity or because of money, but they realize like, okay, well, maybe they kind of bought into this idea that like people want to see fiction, right? And really what they're realizing is like, no, people want the truth. They can handle it, and people will pay attention. Well, I mean, granted, that was in 2001. I don't know how applicable that
I don't
that
know.
message is nowadays, but
I was just talking with a friend who's, I think she's 28. So just for context, but she was saying on the 6th, when everything was going on at the Capitol, she was like switching back and forth between news stations to kind of get what she considered the medium view.
Yeah.
And I like felt that. I knew what she meant.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting because I'm wondering and I don't have an answer for this. I'm just wondering, do certain people on certain sides of the aisle think they're hungering for the truth? Like, do people who buy into Q think that is truth? Like, I guess what I'm questioning is, you said, I don't know if people still like hunger for the truth. And I think I'm wondering if we do still hunger for the truth, but we're so misinformed. Our ideologies are so strong. We've been so misformed and misguided that we see stuff like Q or Fox News or CNN, even though I don't view those three on the same at all level. But you know what I mean? They're the easy scapegoats. Like, do we still have that thirst for truth, but just have such an inability to find it? And because the people in power aren't telling the truth, we have to kind of take it for what it is? I don't know. I'm not trying to like excuse Q by any means. Obviously, the mental gymnastics and what it turned into on the 6th were horrible. So I'm not trying to equivocate at all. But, I hope my point still.
Yeah, I mean, I think it needs to be said that so this is kind of where, reading some James K. Smith talking about postmodernism, I think that's kind of where we're at now, where we've been inculcated this idea that, I don't know if I use that word correctly, but this idea that, truth is relative, right? Because even if there's certain things that we do affirm as being truthful, our culture is built on this idea that what works for you, right? And what works for me. So we've allowed ourselves to go down roads that affirm what we want to believe. So then we get to the point where we're faced with the truth and it doesn't match our truth.
Yep.
And of course we're not going to acknowledge that truth is really truth because of my truth is really truth. But, to be honest, it does fall on both political ideologies. It's not just a Republican or right issue. It's something that the left and independents, libertarians, I mean, we all have these things that we hold on to, and we will justify our beliefs no matter the cognitive dissonance, right? I mean, we all deal with it in different varying capacities. So yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily that people don't want the truth. That's not really what I'm saying. I just think it's like we're not seeing media
telling the truth.
Well, we're not seeing media acknowledging that like that's what would actually sell. Because even if you post a video, you're still pushing a narrative, right? No matter what network it is, you could show a video, but then you could say like, so for example, I saw someone talking today about how there's immigrants pretty much at the border waiting for Biden to come into office, right? And this person's like, oh, I can't believe it. Like, they're just storming. Like, this is exactly Biden's America. But what they didn't acknowledge is that video is true. Yes, there are people who have come from Honduras because of issues in their country, and they have a right to want to seek asylum, right? But what they weren't allowing themselves to recognize is that Biden has already said that, hey, I'm not going to let these people in immediately. We've already got people who've been waiting here for a while. They come first. But then B, if I said A, then B. If I said one, then two. The fact that this happens with every presidency, like that's always a catalyst for that kind of movement. You can look at whether it's Obama or even Trump, right? So it's not just because of Biden. So again, we're all looking at the same information and seeing like, oh, well, people are coming to the border, but what, Fox News is going to tell it differently than NPR. Right.
And I think we talk about, and I'm thinking about this again. We talk about our truth. Like we talk about postmodern relativism. My truth is my truth, whatever. I'm not really convinced we have individual truths. We just don't understand what ideologies we're working under.
Yeah. It's the culture that we've been adopted into.
Yes. And we don't understand that there's more than one culture in America. Certainly more than one, and certainly more than just left and right.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
It's just like, what ideology are we really lending our energies to and our mental faculties? Because even in this one, like even in the movie, there was a certain amount of like mental faculties about how do we, like the prophecies or whatever, like, do we buy into these? Do they fit what I think is true of the world? And a lot of characters were like, no. But then as the facts started to come in, some characters were like, oh, maybe actually.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of these come true, actually.
Well, and it's funny because we could take this like high horse of like, well, Godzilla exists. Why wouldn't you believe that the prophecies are true? And I'm like, because one doesn't entail the other.
Why would a giant lizard dinosaur mean that you can tell the future?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I almost liked it in this movie. So this is leaving the theological, philosophical point, getting back to movie review. I kind of liked it in the sense that not everyone bought the prophecy.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of movies that we've watched where it does, if Godzilla, then whatever else they need to do. If Godzilla, then aliens. Oh, of course. Yeah. There's Godzilla. Why wouldn't there be aliens? So I kind of like it. Like, I don't want every movie to be like me being reintroduced to some new concept and having to watch the characters buy it. Like, yes, in my world, if I saw Godzilla and then the next day there were aliens, I'd be like, well, yeah, sure. Of course, why not? There was one, then there was the other. But I like it when movies aren't always like, well, of course you'd buy all of it. Why would you? So in that sense, can I even say this? It was a sense of realism that I appreciated.
Right. No, I get that. Oh, man. It's not even late, but I'm tired.
Remember when you were like, this is going to be a short one?
Yeah.
And it's an hour.
I know. That's the thing. It could have been a lot longer. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So yeah, in closing here, Chris, because you didn't have a chance to do the last episode, in which I did preface that, but you can tell people I didn't just try to steal thunder here. If you wouldn't mind just sharing some thoughts as the show's coming to a close here, and maybe kind of tantalize our listeners for what's to come.
Yeah. Gosh, I am saying this. It's funny. David and I didn't call each other, but we are cutely matching. I am currently wearing a t-shirt that has a sentence that came out of my mouth on the t-shirt that someone drew a pretty actually kind of baller comic about. It's one of my very few favorited tweets on Twitter right now.
Yep.
Like I'm wearing a t-shirt with the words that I said on it that someone drew a comic of, that someone else printed on a t-shirt that I can put on my extra budgie torso. Like,
did he get
insane.
you the Bella Canvas one too?
No, just this one.
No, the shirt.
Oh, I don't know what that means.
Look at the tag.
I can't. It's on my body.
You can take your shirt off. It's fine.
No.
Just
does it look like? Oh, we'll figure it out.
It's so. Is it comfortable?
It's so comfortable.
Does it feel really good? It's Bella Canvas.
It's like, okay. It feels like cotton.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. Okay. All of our fashion sense aside, it just blows my mind that like I could go from watching one Godzilla movie, 2014, and then people like wanting to hear what I have to say about these movies. It's not good. It's not what I have to say is not good, but y'all are still listening anyway. Or to see like just like random people that of course I've never interacted with, but like just random people talking about like Moist Minia or High Priest Minia.
Oh God, what
It's
did
just
we
like,
do?
Yeah, honestly. So in that sense, it's just kind of crazy because like I never like there's so many people that I've talked with or interacted with, both on the show and on Twitter or whatever, that I just never would have like ever imagined that I could before ever. And it's not because like I have like breathtakingly amazing, splendid thoughts on Godzilla. I don't. I know what I sound like. I know my cocksure attitude makes you think I think I'm hot stuff, but I know what I don't have to, what I have to say is not great. But it just speaks more to like that welcoming environment that I think that I've been able to take part in, and I hope more people are. That just says like the Godzilla fandom's like, hey, well, you're watching the movies. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to think. I'd love to be part of this conversation. That was the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Let's keep talking about it. So it's just crazy. I really keep talking about like people want to listen to me and people want to hear it. No, it's not really what it is. It's just that we've been so welcomed by this community that now as more podcasts come up, that people that still like know ours and still want to interact with us.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know. I mean, that speaks a lot to like David and the relationships that he's made that I've just kind of parasitically leeched on. But it also speaks to a lot of you who are like, yeah, I want to be a part of this. I want to have some of these dumb conversations with Chris. Like there are just some people who we've interacted with and just like face to face on the show in a sense that I love seeing the face they make after I say something just awesome. And the fact that they like wanted that, it's so weird. It's so cool. So
yeah, it's humbling.
I'm very thankful for that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the future, ultra excited to see where we're going to go. Gonna turn the volume up to max on this next one. Man, I don't know.
Yeah. It's going to be a different feel, right? I feel like
yeah.
You're not going to, I don't think we're probably going to get as deep as we have with this show, but there's plenty of moments where it'll happen. It's just,
yeah, I might have like 7 good thoughts an episode.
Yeah.
You might have a few cues after we're done.
I think we'll just have to, swatch ourselves and make sure, we come up with something that people actually want to listen to.
Mm-hmm. I'll pull out my ace in the hole.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you already said something about 7, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like,
I had to go with the ones that I know.
Yeah, I know.
So
that
oh,
that's a reference to, but you might not know that yet. But I did want to give a shout out just to a few. I mean, there's no way we'd be able to thank everybody. I'm sitting here and I'm like trying to come up with a full list, and there's just no way. But Chris is right. I mean, the relationships we've built through this show have been absolutely humbling. Whether it's the guys from Monsters vs. Men, where we share a literal birthday with them when it comes to the podcast. Michael Hamilton, we've got Lisa, Dan, Faye, all the guys over at Something Ghoulish, including the Gargantucast guys, Eric. We've got, there's countless people. I could spend probably the next 10 minutes listing out people. And
Rob and Microsoft Paint.
Yes. And it's just humbling to know that we've done something that could actually bring joy to people's lives. Right. Because that's, at the end of the day, I've kind of looked at my life as like, what kind of legacy do I want to leave behind? Right. And not like I want someone to write a book about me. That's not what I'm saying. But, we were talking earlier about the idea of theosis, right? We become, we are made in the image of God, but we are being transformed into God, into his likeness. It's a gradual process. But, when everything's said and done, I want to be able to look back and what kind of fruit did I bear? Right. So we talk about trees, and trees bear fruit, not for their own sake. They don't consume their own fruit. Trees bear fruit for other people. And I don't want to just make something for myself. I don't want to just do something for myself because, I mean, let's be honest, like there's not that life's too short, but life's too meaningful to just do things for ourselves. There's a joy in selflessness. There's a joy in serving others. And to know that like we have over 50 reviews on iTunes, the fact that like we have people who, like you said, like actively want to listen to what we're doing. It's not about fame. It's not about popularity. It's not about money. It's about somehow we've been able to affect and better lives somehow. And I'm just, that's the kind of legacy I want to have, right? To know that God has used me somehow to bless someone else.
Well, because when it comes down to it, I just learned that we have 50 reviews on iTunes. Like I've only accidentally learned numbers. I've only accidentally learned downloads. Like when it came down to it, we could have had 1 or 100 and I didn't do anything different. Like just the reactions that we got and the conversations that we got made it worth it.
Yeah.
So any success in terms of numbers never factored into my mind because I never asked. I never was told. So because I'm awesome. No, just because it just wasn't ever the concern.
Yeah.
Like, sure, if we had turned out to be like talking to ourselves, then we wouldn't need to record it. We could just call each other. But it was never the content and the quality of the friendships always made up for whatever quantity of listeners we had.
Yep.
Whatever. And I say that whatever because I still don't know. And it still just doesn't.
I don't know where we're at anymore.
Yeah,
and to be honest,
matter.
I used to check, I used to be like, how's this episode performing and stuff like that. And I'm like, this is exhausting. I don't have time to care. And what's funny is I've noticed even as we've not recorded, we still have people listening. I'm like, what's going on? This is awesome.
Welcome. Yeah. It's crazy. I don't know, man. It's just been so funny because there's so many people, so many diverse perspectives and stuff that we've been able to talk with that just would.
Hey, so I'm going to cut you off here. Where is your theological insight?
Oh, well, this one kind of lent itself to what we actually already talked about.
No, are you seriously going to deny everybody?
Oh my gosh. Okay, you'll have to give me a sec because I need to make one that's like silly and not offensive.
Okay, so I'll put some hold music here.
Oh gosh.
It's the hold music. Hold music.
Shoot. I did think about it, but it's like this actually has like real ones. Crap.
All right.
Okay, what if I thought of one and I got it to you before we put it in? Like, what if I just put it in like, whoa, I totally forgot. You have to hear my great theological
I'm just going to
point.
leave all of this in, Chris. So if you come up with something, we'll just slap it in here.
Oh, no. We're not editing anymore.
Yeah, there's only going to be very few edits in this episode.
Oh, man.
That's all right. If you come up with something, I'll throw it in here.
Okay.
So, all right. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in to the Kaiju Apostle podcast one last time. If you like what you heard, if you have a comment you'd like to share, make sure to let us know over our Twitter page. Our handle is Kaiju Apostle Pod. Or you can send us a mail at contact@thekaijuapostle.com. You can follow Chris over on Twitter at Chris Worms, WERMS. But until next time,
may Mothra watch over you, Godzilla empower you, and as always and evermore, may High Priest Moist Minya bring you joy.
I'm kind of Anglican now. I had to do the sign of the cross.
Yeah.
I'm going to hell.
I don't blame you. He's Zilla. He's not Godzilla. It's like he kind of comes as an angel of light. He looks like a good guy, but it turns out it's just a bad guy the whole way through. Where it's kind of like that with Godzilla. They lend themselves to him. They like all of these spirits are like, let's give ourselves to Godzilla. He's going to answer our problems. It's like us giving our authority over to Satan, thinking he's going to answer our problems. But it's not like that, unfortunately.
I'm so glad I hit record.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
I just literally was like, what does Zilla and this Godzilla have in common? Nothing. That's the point.
I missed like the first second or two, but yeah, I got it.
Funny.